Good evening and thank you for joining. My name is Shlomo Katz. I'm the president of the Silver Spring Eruv Association, and I teach Daf Yomi at Southeast Hebrew Congregation in White Oak. The purpose of our presentation tonight is to discuss some of the concepts that we've been learning about, or will soon learn about, in Daf Yomi and Masechet Eruvin, and apply them to a modern Eruv in an architectural context which is very different from what the Mishnah and the Gemara talk about. The joke is told about a man who came to his rabbi and said, "Rabbi, how do you build a sukkah?" So the rabbi pulled out a Gemara sukkah and looked through it and gave the man instructions to build a sukkah. The next day the man came back and said, "Rabbi, I built the sukkah according to your instructions and it fell down." The rabbi looks puzzled and he pulls out the Gemara again and flips through some pages and says, Tosos asked that question. So just as one could, if one really tried, learn how to build a sukkah from learning Masechet Sukkah, one could, and we do, learn how to build an Eruv in our modern environment from Masechet Eruvin, but it is not all that obvious, and the purpose of this presentation is to try to make some of those connections. An Eruv consists of three parts, and the first part, which is the actual Eruv, is not the walls and the wires and the fences and so on that form the enclosure, but as we will learn, we did learn 2 days ago or 3 days ago in Daf Yomi, the Eruv consists of food. The Mishnah says on Daf Chav Vav Amud Beis, "Bakol ma'arvin u'mishtatfin chutz min hamayim min hamelach." You can make an Eruv with anything except water or salt. Rashi says that this refers, among other things, to Eruve Chatzeros, and that's what our Eruv is. It is an Eruve Chatzeros. The word Eruv means a mixture. Chatzeros means courtyards, and we are mixing all of our individual courtyards together and becoming one through the food. As Rashi in the lower left-hand corner of the slide explains, that the way an Eruv works is that a person is where his food is, as the expression goes. The way to a man's heart is through his stomach, and where a person's food is, that's where he lives. So if we all contribute, or if somebody on our behalf takes some food and puts it in one house in the Chatzer, or in one place in the community, on behalf of all of us, then that makes that place our house. And today, an Eruv is made with a box of matzah, because it is durable. It typically is every year. The box of matzah in this picture is from my kitchen cabinet. It is not the box of matzah which is the Eruv, but the idea is the same. Tosfos points out, arguing with Rashi, that this particular Mishnah is not talking about Eruv Chatzeros, because everyone agrees that an Eruv Chatzeros has to be bread. And that's clear later in the Gemara on Daf Ayin Aleph, and matzah is bread as well. So that is actually what the term Eruv technically means. It refers to the food. The second part of the Eruv is learned from a Mishnah, Daf Samech Aleph, about a little more than 20 days from now. We'll get there. Mishnah says, Hadar im ha'akum b'chatzer, o im mishi no modeh be'eruv. If one lives in a courtyard with a non-Jew, or with a Jew who does not acknowledge the legitimacy of Eruv, hareze oser alav, then that non-Jew, or that Jew who denies the validity of an Eruv, of the concept of an Eruv, prohibits the other religious Jews who live in the Chatzer, in the courtyard, from carrying. And similarly, in our enclosure, the non-Jews and any Jews who don't believe in the legitimacy of Eruv would prohibit us from carrying from our houses into the enclosed area, unless we got permission. And the way we get permission is through the county executive. This is how it's typically done in the United States, either through the mayor or the county executive. And you see here the most recent proclamation, which covers the Kent Mill and White Oak Eruv. In the lower right-hand corner, you see then County Executive Charles Gilchrist around 1982 signing an earlier version of the proclamation And some of you may recognize my father on the right side of the picture, one of the early leaders of the Eruv. The rest of our discussion will focus on the best known part of the Eruv, which is the Eruv enclosure. And the key to the modern Eruv is what's known as a tzurat hapetach. The tzura means a form, a shape, and a petach means an opening. It's the form of a doorway. The very first Mishnah in Masechet Eruvin, which is talking about a structure of a mavoi, an alleyway with courtyards off of it, as we'll see a picture of in a moment, mentions that the maximum size of an opening that's permitted to a mavoi is 10 amos. But if it has a tzuras hapesach, the form of a doorway, then it can be more than 10 amos. Rashi says that the significance of 10 amos is that a typical doorway is not more than 10 amos wide. An amma, depending on whose measurements you follow, is between 1.5 and 2 feet. And that doorways are assumed not to be more than 10 amos wide. So if it's more than 10 amos wide, it can't be called a doorway. It's called a hole in the wall. But a tzurat hapetach, which Rashi says is a lechi on this side and a lechi on that side, and a korah or a kane on top. All of these terms we will define momentarily, but you do see a picture right under the highlighted Rashi of a tzurat hapetach. You see the outline of the mavoi, of the alleyway, with 2 poles and a horizontal something going across the top. Here you have a picture from the picture book on Eruvin, the Perish Chai, of a classical arrangement of a mavoi running across the front here. You have a Rishus Harabim, a public domain, then you have a mavoi, an alleyway, and off the mavoi are chatzeros, courtyards with houses. So this here is the tzuras hapesach. The 2 alephs are the vertical poles, which Rashi calls the lechis. The Gemara doesn't use that term in this context. In the Gemara, a lechi means something different. But as you saw, Rashi calls them lechis, and many of the halachos of these boards on the side are learned from the lechis, from the halachos of a lechi. And on top, you have a horizontal beam, and some of the halachos of that will be learned from korah. A lot of what I'm going to say, incidentally, it presumes that you are currently or at some time have learned Masechet Eruvin. On another occasion, I hope to give a presentation for a general audience, but I will be assuming some knowledge on the part of the audience, such as talking about a lechi and a korah and a mavoi and a chatzer and so on. So in this slide over here, you see a korah being a board of wood, but the Gemara on Daf Yud Aleph tells us that a tzuras hapesach does not have to be made out of boards of wood. The Gemara says, there was a man in the valley of Beit Hortan who stuck 4 posts in the ground at 4 corners of his field, and he stretched a vine across between them. And the Chachamim permitted this for purposes of kilayim. The halacha is that if you have grapes planted in one area, you are not allowed to plant vegetables right next to them. You have to leave a certain amount of space. The Mishnah in Kilayim has complicated formulas for calculating how much space you need to leave. However, if you have a wall next to the grapes, you can plant wheat or anything else right up to the other side of the wall. And what we learn here is that it doesn't have to be an actual wall, but even if you have a tzuras hapesach, a form of a doorway, you have a vertical post, another vertical post, something horizontal going across, and the same thing on all 4 sides. If you would have grapes planted inside this area, you could plant wheat or something else right up to the line, as if there was an actual wall. And Rashi tells us that the tzurat hapetach for the context of kilayim, of planting different produce together, counts as a mechitza. And the Gemara says, Kachi tiru lo linyan Shabbat. The same thing applies to Shabbos. There's a long discussion about that in the Gemara, but that is the conclusion, that a tzurat petach is an actual mechitza. And one of the Rishonim, the Rashba, one of the early commentaries, says this quite clearly in a number of places. These are just two of number of excerpts, and these are brought down in the poskim, in the svarim that decide halacha, that a tzurat petach is a mechitza gemura. It's an absolute mechitza. It's a wall, and this is important because, as we learn elsewhere in the Masechet, an enclosure has to be mostly closed, and rather than being mostly open and only partly closed. Well, then how is this thing with vertical posts and vines across the top an enclosure? The answer is, if it's a tzurat petach, if it meets the requirements of being a tzurat petach, it is considered a wall. It is just like the door of your house is part of the wall of your house. We don't consider it a hole in the wall. It's part of the wall of your house. So too, I should say the doorway rather than the door, because there is no door here. So too, these are considered absolute walls. And that has a number of technical other areas of significance in halacha that we're not going to have a chance to get into in the time that we have. But we do view a tzuras pesach as an absolute mechitza, an absolute wall. The Gemara.
Would you call that a virtual wall?
That is the expression that I have been using in teaching Daf Yomi. Yes. Whether that's the best way, I don't know, but that's actually what I've been calling it. But it has, for purposes of halacha, it is a wall like any other wall, both for purposes of kilayim and for purposes of carrying on Shabbos. So, for example, going back to here, if you are standing outside at the bays, out in Rosh Hashanah, and you would throw something into this area, you would be chayav skila. You'd be liable for the punishment of stoning for transgressing Shabbos, assuming there were two witnesses and they warned you and so on. It is absolutely a wall, an enclosure, like any other enclosure.
And it will be also for when we get to Sukkah, right?
That's an interesting question, and I'm going to avoid answering any practical halachic questions, but consult your local Orthodox rabbi. The Gemara on Daf Yud Aleph, I might make an exception for Eruv questions, but even then, I probably will defer them. On Daf Yud Aleph,
I just meant the concept of the virtual wall. That if you have a line, if you have a carved across it, you
have applications. A lot of what we are going to discuss tonight has applications. Has applications to Hilchos Sukkah. Yes, that is true. The Gemara on Daf Yud Aleph on Beis refers to a case of two posts stuck in the ground and a pei'ah between them, which Rashi says is the same thing as the kind of vine we've been talking about, and again describes this as a tzuras pesach. So moving to a practical application, the simplest tzuras pesach is two utility poles with a power line going right over the top of each of them. Okay. We love when we have this available because it costs nothing for us to build. It's extremely easy to check. You don't have to get out of the car. For example, on the length of Georgia Avenue from Forest Glen Road all the way up to Veers Mill Road, or to 2 poles south of Veers Mill Road, is what we call over the top. And the Eruv checkers can just drive up Georgia Avenue and look out the window, and no additional effort is required. Of course, if such a tzuras pesach breaks, it is not within our capability to fix it. or if one of these telephone poles is removed on a Friday afternoon, it causes tremendous problems, and it has happened. So we've also been very, very fortunate. One time on a Friday afternoon, I saw some workers who looked like they were getting ready to move some telephone poles, and I stopped and I introduced myself. I said, "Are you planning on working on Saturday?" And they said yes. I said, "Is it possible you could work somewhere else and not move these poles on Saturday?" And the guy called the supervisor, and they got permission to go somewhere else. And it's now 5 years later, they still haven't come back.
Shlomo?
Yes.
It's Bob. When I'm looking at the wires, or practically speaking, is it the upper wire or the lower wire or the middle wire that you use?
My mouse.
I'm sorry?
And you see my mouse?
Yeah, it's the middle one.
It's the middle one that goes right over the top.
Right over the top. And you don't need a separate lechi. You're using the post is the lechi.
In this case, the pole is the lechi, or in technical terms, the kanesh shebetzido, kanesh shebetzido, and this is the kanesh al gabehen, the board on the top, except it's an electrical wire. It's a high power, called a high tension wire.
Shlomo, must it be over it
Must
or
be
through it?
We'll discuss that. No, it should be directly over the top. There are circumstances where it could be through it, as long as it's through it directly over the pole. That's more complicated. We're not going to get into that. That's beyond the scope of this presentation. But yes, there are circumstances where it could go through it also.
What about the side?
We're going to talk about that.
So, Shlomo, Tzuras Pesach doesn't have to only exist in conjunction with a mavoi, does it, or something resembling a mavoi?
That is correct, and that's exactly the point of this presentation, which is to transfer the concepts from the Gemara's discussion of mavoi and chotzer to our modern eruv, which has properties of both a mavoi and a chotzer, and as we'll see later, potentially a karpef. Hopefully not a karpef. We'll talk about that later, but that's exactly the point. I'm going to ask that unless a question is essential, to try to hold it, because I do want to make sure to get through, and some of the questions that have been asked are things we're going to get to. So the point here is what you see is that there's a pole, a wire that goes right over the top and down the other side, and of course this continues. This is taken on George Avenue, as you can see. And this continues, about 1.8 miles, for length of about 1.8 miles on Georgia Avenue. Another type of Tzuras Petach is one that we do have to make ourselves. Here you see the Beltway crossing over Northwest Branch between New Hampshire Avenue, which is behind us. If we're standing and looking at this picture on University Boulevard, this is the sign that says exit for University Boulevard right here. And so you have the noise wall, which carries the eruv up to this point, but the noise wall ends. And now we need to get across this ravine, which is 500 feet across and about 200 to 250 feet deep. And we need to get across it. So one possibility, of course, would be to follow this fence that you could see here all the way down somewhere and make it Tzuras Petach. But what we've chosen to do, after experimenting with lots of different things over a 40-year period, is we go straight across. So over here, let me go next slide. So at this red arrow, you can see a lechi, and this lechi is right up against the wall, almost touching it. It is lavud. We will talk about the concept of lavud shortly. Then there is a wire. This blue arrow is pointing to a string. It's not a wire, a string that goes from this pole to a lechi that you can't see, which is hidden by this pole, and they're connected. And then this is the lechi here, this other red arrow. The red arrows are lechis, the blue arrows are pointing to strings, and as you can see, this goes across. It then disappears. The reason is that this part that you see is white, the rest of it is black. That is intentional to make it invisible to drivers. If you know what you're looking for, you can see it frequently. every couple months, I get phone calls from people commuting home from work or wherever saying, I drove across the big bridge, I didn't see the string, and I will always, even though I know it's there and I know why they didn't see it, because they're not meant to see it. But if you call me, even on a Friday afternoon, and say, I drove across and didn't see the string, I will go out and check it. So please, we appreciate the input from our users who are commuting or wherever. Not too many people commute nowadays, but wherever you're going. So the easiest way we check this is if this is parallel to the ground, then we know the rest of it has to be up. It's under tension from the other side. If the string was down, this would not stay parallel to the ground. Here is the string. Now we're looking towards New Hampshire Avenue, and here is the string. If you are having trouble seeing it, there's some arrows to help you see it. If you still can't see it, here's a closer up view, and you can see the string right across there. A tzuras Pesach can be made of almost anything. At different times, this has been made out of fishing line, dental floss, thanks to Dr. Jerry Tarragon, who once donated a 600-foot roll of dental floss, which we tried out and used for a while. When Eruv repair volunteers get bored, no, seriously, when we need to fix this string, which happens not too often, even in really bad weather, we've been very successful, but more often it's construction that will knock down the string. This is where we go for a walk, just for fun. If you recognize that person, it's not me. If you recognize that person, don't tell his wife. Now, the Gemara says, on Daf Yud Aleph from Bet, Gufa Amar Chista, Tzurata Petach Sha'asa Min Hatzad, Lo Asa Velo Klum. If you made the Tzuras Pesach on the side, as you see here, this board is not on top, it's on the side. Lo Asa Velo Klum, you've done nothing. You've accomplished nothing. So some telephone poles or utility poles don't have the wire going over the top like the ones we looked at before. The wires are all either on these branches, which are not over the top of the pole, or they run, in this case, it happens to be one that runs right by the side of the top. I don't know what it's doing there exactly. But those would not qualify to be part of the Tzurat HaPetach, because if this was the Lachi, now if this branch came out directly under this, there would be an opinion that would qualify, but it doesn't. So it doesn't help. So here, there's no over the top, and we have to do something else, because all of these are min hatzad. They're on the side of the pole, and at Tzurat HaPetach min hatzad, lo asav lo klum, it's nothing. So I'm going to show you what we do and invoke some other Eruv concepts. So here you have a pole. Here are the top wire ends, so it's of no use to us. This is at the corner of University Boulevard in Amherst, and this doesn't go anywhere, doesn't go across the street. So we need to be using these lower wires, which are, and in different places they're arranged differently, but the lower wires are the Verizon and the Comcast wires. Sometimes one's lower, sometimes the other. And we need to form two tzurot petach, one going in that direction, one going in that direction. In theory, we might be able to use one lechi, except that in this place happens to be, because of where the wires go off the picture, we can't use the same lechi. We need two different ones. So we'll see both of them as we go along. So this is this is the entire pole, and going up to center here, which is enlarged over here, is a black plastic molding. It's the same thing utility companies use, which is good because it looks like it belongs on the pole, and it's very unlikely to be vandalized or even to be removed by a utility worker because he thinks it belongs there. And it actually goes under this, you can't see, and it goes under the wire and straight past it up to here, where it is, there's a little white cap. That's how we do it to make it recognizable, not a halachic issue, that's a practical issue. And it's directly under this wire, which is this second wire here. So that lechi is directly under it and forms a shrata petach between the lechi on the side of this pole, this wire, which goes this way to another pole that's off the picture.
And you need a second lechi for. Sorry, you need a second lechi for the bottom wire.
We do need a second lechi for the bottom wire because this one goes. It doesn't go to the wire; it goes past the wire.
On the side.
It passes underneath it. There's a space, and it passes underneath it. You'll have to take my word for that. And you'll see later, shortly, what we do for this other wire that goes in this direction. That's the lechi down here. We'll talk about it in more detail a little later in the presentation. Very shortly. The Gemara says, Tana tzrata petach she'amru kanemi kan v'kanemi kan v'kanal gabihen. Tzrata petach is a board on this side, a board on that side, and a board on top, whereas we've seen they don't have to be boards. Gemara asks, Shrichim liga or ain't Shrichim liga? Do they need to touch, like this one, or do they not need to touch, like this one? Rav Nachman says they don't need to touch, do not need to touch. Rav Sheshet says they do need to touch, and the Gemara goes on and relates how Rav Sheshet came to change his mind and agree that they do not need to touch, and that is the halacha, they do not need to touch. The reason they do not need to touch is a concept that is mentioned later in the Masechet called Gud Asik Mechitzata. On Daf Pei Tet Amud Aleph, Rashi explains Gud Asik means Mishoch v'ha'aleh, stretch it and raise it up. So we, again, could use the word virtually, stretch this pole as if it raises up to there. And that's what we do on this. Is the same pole we were looking at before. This is now we're looking at the bottom half. And on the left enlarged picture, you can see some boards of wood. We call these temporary lechis because we put them up on Friday afternoons when we don't have access to a bucket truck. And since we don't have access to a bucket truck too regularly, they end up staying for a while, but eventually we get around to fixing it. One of the reasons why community members are asked to donate to the Eruv, in addition to paying for the weekly inspectors, is hiring the contractor with the bucket truck. So this lechi is under this wire here, as shown by the dotted vertical line. If it's not perfectly vertical in the picture, it's meant to be, but the lechi is under the wire. And you'll notice, incidentally, that this pole is not actually vertical. It's kind of warped or bent out of shape here. Whether it was always that way or it happened over time, I don't know. But that's very important if you are putting up an Eruv. I've seen Eruvin in other cities where somebody just assumed the pole is vertical and therefore he nailed the board parallel to the pole and assumed it would be under the wire, and that's not a good assumption. And that is a serious mistake that is made all too often. You do need to make sure that the board is under the wire and take into account any bends or leaning or turning of the poles. And one of the reasons these need to be checked is because poles settle over time, or they get hit by cars and they move, and so on. So this is an example of a tzurata petach. Again, it goes across University Boulevard to the other side to make it tzurata petach. Here's a kaneh shebetzido, which does not reach the top. It relies on the principle of gud asik. And this is a principle that applies to a sukkah as well, in terms of your walls of your sukkah not needing to reach the schach. We're now going to turn to the discussion of materials of which lechis can be made. The Gemara, again, is discussing a different kind of lechi, but the same basic concepts apply. So the Mishnah on Daf Tet Vav says, Bakol osin l'chayayin, you can make lechis out of anything, even living things, even people, in fact, if they don't know that they're being used as a lechi. That's a whole separate discussion. You can make lechis out of almost anything. On Daf Chet Amud Aleph, there was a discussion of a bent mavoi, which had a lechi in the corner there was essentially a rolled up carpet. Rashi says it was a budya, which Rashi says is a mat, a reed mat. So it could be a rolled up carpet for our purposes. Gemara says that was no good. Why? Kevan de nashiv bezika v'shadi leilo klumhu. Since the wind would blow, it would take it away. It's nothing. The nights besichta, but if you would stick a pin in, if you would pin it to the wall, v'chabre, and you connect it, then you connected it, and it would be fine. So, a practical application of that. I'll show you a few of them. So here is the Eruv wire. This is not far from the previous one we looked at. This is in front of the 7-Eleven on Amherst Avenue. And this is the wire. And the lechi is this metal casing, which of course needs to be directly under the wire, and it is. So this metal casing is the lechi. This is a principle which we learned in the Gemara of a lechi homemade me'ilav, a lechi which is there by itself. Of course, a human being put this here, but the human being who put it here had no conception that it would be a lechi someday. So it's essentially a lechi that is there on its own. Here's another lechi. The Gemara said that a chut hasarbal, the drawstring of a jacket, could be a lechi. And here you have a string, which is a lechi. Some of you may have noticed last Friday, the Eruv announcement was later than usual. And the reason for that was that this particular string was waving in the wind. A lechi, unlike the top part, the kaneh shal gabav, also called a mashkof, which is allowed to wave in the wind according to most poskim, and that's how we hold, a lechi is not allowed to move in the wind. And this string had stretched in the very heavy rains that we had I think it was Thursday. And because it had stretched, it was waving in the wind. And because of other things that were going on here, I was not able to fix it until after 4 o'clock when the construction workers who were working nearby had gone home. And so we just had to untie it at the bottom. It goes down to the ground. I had to untie it from its support and make it taut and retie it. But this is an example of a string like a chut hasarbal mentioned in the Gemara used as a lechi. This is not part of our Eruv. This is an Eruv in another city where I have relatives, and it consists of 3 Tupperware containers nailed to the tree or nailed to this board. But this board is not the Eruv, is not the lechi, because as you might be able to tell, this tree is bent. So where the wire is connected, it would not be above this board, but it is above these 3 Tupperware containers, which make the lechi. So a lechi really can be almost anything. Now, one interesting discussion regarding lechi, regarding Tzuras Pesach, we learned in the Gemara, just talking about a lechi and a korah, there were different opinions whether they are mishum mechitza. Do a lechi and a korah make a wall? Does a lechi make a wall, a virtual wall? Does a korah on a mavoi make a virtual wall? Or are they mishum heker? Are they simply reminders not to carry? And there are different consequences to those. So we already saw that a mechitza, that a tzurat petach is a mechitza gmura. It's an absolute mechitza. But there is a discussion, does a tzurat petach have to be a heker also? That discussion is not in the Gemara. It is a discussion in the poskim. But it is based in part on the Gemara and based in part on Yerushalmi, since it's not found in our Gemara explicitly. The Gemara says that l'Rabbanan korah tamamai. What's the reason for a korah on a mavoi according to Rabbanan? Mishum hekera. It's because of a heker. Rashi says, why did the Rabbanan require it to be less than 20 amos tall, or up to 20 amos tall, more correctly? Mishum heker, so that people will see it and will know that this mavoi has been fixed for carrying. Because if it was too high, then nobody would notice it, and it wouldn't serve as a heker. And for similar reasons, we find that a sukkah is not allowed to be, the schach is not allowed to be more than 20 amos tall. However, the Gemara says, regarding a korah, inishla amaltera, if it has an amaltera, afilu gvaya ter mishrama inot tzirich l'ma'et. Even if it's more than 20 amos high, you don't have to lower it. The amaltera is a term borrowed from the Beis Hamikdash. This is the amaltera, or here, okay. And it's a visual. It's something that draws your eye upwards. So if your Korah had some kind of design on it, some kind of artwork on it, then it would visually draw your eye upwards. And the discussion in the poskim is whether a Tzuras HaPesach, we said that a Tzuras HaPesach inot tzarich liga, the sides don't have to touch. But what if the top is more than 20 amos high? Do the sides have to touch in that case? Is there a heker requirement for a Tzuras HaPesach or not? And that is a machlokas in poskim, including in contemporary poskim. And an application of that would be here, where you have a pole for various reasons. The only wire we could use here was this top one, but you can't really see in the picture. It does not go over the top, so the pole could not be a lechi. We had to, on a Friday afternoon, we needed to put a lechi up, and obviously we cannot reach 40 or 50 feet high, more than 20 amos. We could only put a short lechi, and so if you would hold that a Tzuras HaPesach that is more than 20 amos high, the lechi must reach the top, this would not be kosher. The policy in our Eruv is we always try to meet as many opinions as possible. However, the guidance from Rabbi Einemer Zatzal was that on a Friday afternoon, we must do whatever it takes to have the Eruv up, even if it means relying on fewer opinions. And so this is something that we did at some point. It's no longer in use. It has been, we put up a more halachically ideal solution as soon as we were able to. But at one time, whenever Google Maps drove by, this is how it was, and lucky for me, because now I have a picture to show you. So this is an example of where that question would come into play, because these wires are only about 20 feet up. That's not 20 amos. But this wire is more than 20 amos high. So that's an example of that shiloh. Another question that comes up is, so we have this lechi here. How do we know it's under that wire? So generally we will make it as wide as we can, and you can see an example of that if you happen to drive by the corner of Amherst and Reedy tomorrow. You'll see such a lechi. It's not serving a wire 20 amos high, but a very wide lechi. But there are Eruvs whose policy is to use laser levels and other kinds of surveying equipment. And again, we use a simple plumb line. Again, the guidance from Rabbi Einemer was to rely on the naked eye and not to require high-tech types of guidance. At one point, he said about a certain piece of equipment, I don't think Moshe Rabbeinu had one of those. So that is our policy. Moving to another subject now, the Gemara discusses that a korah or a lechi can only serve an area which is at least 4 tvachim wide. I'm going to go a little faster now because we are running out of time. So you may remember these cases of a mavoi that had a hole in it, but if the front of the mavoi was 4 tvachim deep, then it was okay to have an opening, a large opening in it. And similarly, if you need to lower the ground of the mavoi to make this the appropriate height, one opinion was you had to go 4 tvachim deep. A practical application of this is here you have a row of wires that are over the top, and here you have backyard fences, and this is the wires. They are indeed over the top, but we cannot use them as a Tzuras HaPesach because these are the bottoms of these two poles. And right here you see this pole is flush against this fence. We are standing outside the Eruv. From this lechi to this fence is not an area of 4 tfachim. If we wanted to use the tzurat petach that's formed by this pole and the wire on top, it would not be serving an area that's 4 tfachim deep, and therefore it would not be a valid tzurat pesach. So instead, we have to use this fence. And over here, this is at the left side of the previous picture, where we connect back to the tzuras pesach, we have to close this area off because it's more than 3 tfachim wide, so it's not lavud, and we'll now talk about lavud. We'll shortly talk about lavud. The Gemara discussed the case of doors, and if you're relying on doors, do they need to be closed or be able to be closed? We have a practical example of that on Old Randolph Road, where the school bus yard lot is. When Shabbos starts early in the winter, the school buses are not all home yet, and this gate is open. But since the gate can close, or according to another opinion, since the gate does actually close at night, it is kosher. In this area, this is more than the maximum amount of opening that would be allowed in an Eruv, but more than 10 amos. But since it has gates that do close at night, or according to another opinion, gates that can close at night, we can rely on it. Okay, now talking about lavud. So lavud, it means that when you have objects, vertical or horizontal objects that are less than 3 tfachim apart, they're considered to form a solid wall because they're not big enough for a goat to walk through. Here's an example of vertical lavud. This is on University Boulevard. This fence is used as part of the Eruv, and it's more open than closed. It's parutz omed ala meruba ala omed, parutz meruba ala omed, but because it's less than 3 tfachim between each of these posts, is considered a solid wall. Okay. Lavud can also work horizontally. For example, if you have a hanging wall, but it's more than 3 tfachim off the ground, or if you have 3 strings going across, but more than 3 tfachim off the ground, it does not form a mechitza. Here's an example of that. Chain link fence is a mechitza because each of these spaces is less than 3 tfachim, so this is a solid wall, but due to erosion, it is more than 3 tfachim off the ground, and that would invalidate the Eruv if not that we had done something else to bypass this space. Here's more erosion, same idea. And here's more. This is under the noise wall of the Beltway. There are openings which, if they were 10 amos wide and 3 tfachim high, would invalidate the Eruv. Gemara discussed concept of parutz meruba ala omed, omed meruba ala parutz, taking openings of different sizes and putting boards of different sizes in the spaces so that you can consider this closed, and this is only 10 amos, so it's a valid opening, and so on. All kinds of different permutations Gemara discussed. A practical application of that, I showed you before, 1 hole under the Beltway noise wall, but sometimes there are multiple holes and they are close together, and we have to figure out whether this hole and this hole and this hole should be combined. These are 3 separate holes. Should they be combined to be considered 1 hole, or in which case the Eruv would not be valid, or should they be considered separate holes? And that applies the principles that are discussed in the Gemara there. Gemara gives an example of a tzuras pesach like this, and we have here's a fence and an opening of more than 10 amos with a tzuras pesach, and we have one exactly like that in our Eruv. Here's the fence, here's the string. The string is sagging. Most poskim hold that a string may sag, and that follows of necessity from the fact that the Gemara said you could use a vine. Vines typically sag. There is an opinion that the Gemara is talking about where you made it very, very taut, so it doesn't sag. There's also discussion in poskim about how much it can sag, but this is certainly an allowable amount. And I noticed yesterday that the state or whoever's in charge has actually fixed this fence, so that's very recent. We talked about a tel hamitlaket asara mitoch arba, a mound. So on top of this mound, if it goes up 10 tfachim in a distance of 4 amos, then on top of this is a Rishus HaYachid. And likewise, this could form the wall of an Eruv. As you see here, it's being used as one of the corner posts of the Pasei Biraos, the area around the well. Practical application. Here, you can't necessarily tell in the picture, but this does meet those dimensions of going up 10 tfachim or more over a slope of 4 amos or less, and same thing over here. Here it's even steeper. This is another view of a different season of this same pole, and maybe you could see here that it's steeper, I'm not sure. But anyway, so this slope forms a wall of the Eruv. This is a stream bank. It's almost vertical. You're looking straight down into the stream. Also, at one time was used as a wall of the Eruv. The Gemara discusses a lot about karpefos. A karpef, Rashi says, is a storage area where they would store wood. It's an enclosure which was not enclosed for habitation. And there are a number of different examples of that. And the Gemara talks about what happens when a karpef is open to a chatzer. Are you allowed to carry in the chatzer, or does the fact that it's completely open to a karpef invalidate it? Because a karpef is an area where if it is more than 5,000 square amos, you may not carry. If the karpef is less than 5,000 amos, you can carry in it. If it's more than 5,000 amos, you cannot carry in a karpef. And if the chatzer is open to the karpef, you may not carry in the chatzer either. And the same question would come up if your enclosure floods, or if you have a lake, such as the lake in Wheaton Regional Park, which is more than 5,000 square amos, and the Eruv is open to it. And the reason that that's permitted, Rashi says that if you could drink the water, then it's okay. You cannot drink this water, but there are others who say if you could use the water for any purpose, and this water is used for recreational purposes, and therefore it can be considered as if it's hukaf ledira, it's enclosed for purposes of habitation. Another type of karpef that Eruvin frequently have to deal with is cemeteries. This is not in our Eruv. This is Har Zesim in Yerushalayim, which sadly is not in our Eruv. And this is the type of cemetery that definitely would be problematic for an Eruv. You would not do anything in this cemetery. You wouldn't, it's in no way mukaf ledira, and I'm sure this cemetery is outside the Eruv of Yerushalayim. However, there are cemeteries that nowadays are used for recreational purposes. This is a cemetery that is in Fairfax, Virginia, inside the area that they are working on building. They're building a new Eruv there, and this is inside of the area. And there are poskim who say that if people use the cemetery for recreational purposes, as crazy as that sounds, then it is mukaf ledira. It's not a karpef. And sure enough, Ann Arbor, Michigan decides against banning dogs in city cemeteries. They are places where you could walk your dog or jog, and therefore, according to some poskim, they do not invalidate an Eruv. Lastly, almost lastly, is the question, you hear sometimes people say, I don't use the Eruv. And it may sound very haughty. It may sound like they think they know better, that the Eruv is no good. And in most cases, that's not what they're talking about at all. Can't say all cases, but in most cases. An Eruv, such as we've been discussing, is not valid around a Reshus Harabim Doraisa. It's only valid around a Carmelis, which is, a Carmelis is an area where it's only prohibited to carry midrabanan, according to rabbinic law. But a Reshus Harabim, according to Torah law, you cannot carry there with the type of Eruv that we have been discussing. Rashi defines a Reshus Harabim as a place which is 16 amos wide, and 16 amos wide, goes straight through, and 600,000 people are found there, just like the 600,000 adult males in the camp of Bnei Israel, and it has no wall. And without getting into any controversy about the Eruv in Manhattan, but a potential Tzuras HaPesach, a potential Rosh Hashanah would be Times Square. Another potential Rosh Hashanah might be our Capitol Beltway, although it is not straight. Not all poskim require it to be straight. This is one of the reasons, this is the major reason, why Kemp Mill and White Oak on the one hand and Woodside on the other hand have a separate Eruvin, because the Capitol Beltway, which is possibly Rosh Hashanah Doraisa, runs through. There are Rishonim who hold that Rosh Hashanah is only something 16 amos wide. It doesn't have to have 600,000 people there, and therefore all of our streets, pretty much, unless you live in a dead-end neighborhood, actually like I do, but most of our streets would be Rosh Hashanah according to that opinion. For example, Arcola Avenue, running in front of the yeshiva here in Kent Mill, and therefore some people do not use the Eruv because according to many opinions, this is a Rosh Hashanah Doraisa. Arcola Avenue is Rosh Hashanah Doraisa, and cannot be enclosed with our type of Eruv. Obviously, as a community, we don't hold that way. We do have an Eruv, but many individuals do hold that way, and the Mishnah Berurah praises them for holding that way. Lastly, just a bit of nostalgia. The Gemara talked about a mavoy akum, a bent mavoy, and how you fix that. We don't have any of these in our Eruv, but you can go to Yerushalayim and you can see them, plenty of them. This is, you might recognize if you walk in Shar Yafo on your way to the Kotel, and you turn right into the Armenian Quarter, and then turn left into a narrow alleyway. So this is just a few yards ahead of you where you take a sharp turn to the left and then a sharp turn to the right. And there's a discussion in the poskim, both in Eretz Yisrael and in Europe in the Middle Ages, of why is there no lechi right here, or Tzuras HaPesach, or something. And that is a subject that we do not have to deal with in our Eruv, but I figured why not end with a picture of Yerushalayim if I could. So thank you very much for participating. I know some of you do have to go to Daf Yomi momentarily. I do have time for questions for a few minutes. If anybody has any questions, please.
So I was wondering in terms of the 20 amod high. So do we hold that it has to be lower than 20 amod, or that's just an issue if we're concerned about heker? Like, how does that work in terms of the Eruv nowadays?
Okay, so it's not that it has to be less than 20 amos high. A Tzuras Pesach can be of any height. The question is, if the lechi doesn't go all the way up to the top, is the idea of the heker, we said with the amaltera, the idea is to draw your eye upwards. So if you, the Gemara in Masachet Sukkah says that if your schach is more than 20 amos high and your walls go all the way up to the schach, it's okay. It's only when your walls don't go all the way up to the schach that your schach may not be 20 amos high. And there are poskim who say the same thing about a Tzuras HaPesach, that if the lechi doesn't go all the way up to the top, it may not be 20 amos high, more than 20 amos high. If the lechi does go all the way up, then it could be of any height. So we do not, as a matter of absolute policy, follow the stricter opinion. We do try, whenever it's practical, to follow as many opinions as possible. I'm not going to, but I could tell you prominent poskim according to whom our Eruv is not kosher. But we do try to follow as many opinions as possible, but if we're making a repair on a Friday afternoon, then it's often not possible until we can bring the bucket truck in to improve whatever we've done temporarily, which takes time. The same contractor, in addition to checking the Eruv every week in Baltimore, also serves all of the Eruvs in the Washington area, and also has a day job. So he's a pretty busy man. If anybody wants to donate a bucket truck to the Eruv, we might consider accepting it, but that's a big expense. So that's the answer to your question.
Thank
wanted
you
to
very much.
I wanted
Very,
to
very
mention.
informative.
I want to mention the other individual in that with your father in that picture was George Lowell.
Correct.
Who
That's
was
Dr.
one of
George
the,
Lowell.
yeah, who was one of the people who was one of the original movers and shakers to make an Eruv.
And Dr. Lowell, actually, let me stop screen sharing so you can see me. About 2 years ago, I ran into Dr. Lowell in the street, and he gave me, as a gift, the original proclamation that was being signed in that picture, and I have it hanging on my wall. The current proclamation actually is not hanging, but it's right here, sitting on the floor next to my desk. But yes, that was George Lowell. There were other people involved in the beginning, Josh Rosenblum, Oliver Shalom, Jacques Orlin, who has moved away, I think. Does he still live in Kent Mill? I'm not sure.
He's in Eretz Yisrael.
Okay, so those were the primary people. There were some others at the beginning.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
I'm
Yeah.
also wondering about the whole Mavoy Chatzer thing. Is anything in our community considered that, or just it's all a Carmelist, so it's okay to enclose?
Well, a mavoy also is a Carmelist until you enclose it, until you put up the Korah. The areas of our cities have attributes of both mavoy and Chatzer, and it's really more complex than I could explain without, first of all, going through it myself again, but in the time that we have.
Shlomo, the 600,000 requirement for Rishus HaRabim, how is that defined? Is that residents within a certain area, or people who actually traverse that area over a given period of time, or
those are two possibilities discussed by the commentaries and the poskim, and there are others as well. There are many different opinions, and that's part of the reason why there is controversy about both in Manhattan and Brooklyn about having Eruvin for that reason, because different poskim define that differently based on different sources in Rishonim and so on.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you.
I had a question about the matzah, actually.
About what?
As a sign about the matzah. Exactly where is it? Is it in every shul, or is it in one specific shul? And also, what do you do for Pesach?
So the matzah is, I believe, stored under the Aron Kodesh at Shomrei Muna. It used to be, I see Barry Greengard, it used to be in his house. But at some point, many years ago, it was moved to shul. And every Shabbos Hagadol, previously Rabbi Einemer and now Rabbi Rosenbaum renews it, and there's a bracha to say, Asher Kishan Stav Tzivanu Amitat Eruv, and that it says that publicly in front of the shul. I don't know what happened this year, whether it was changed or not. I've been meaning actually to ask Rabbi Rosenbaum about that. It doesn't have to be, as long as it's still edible and matzah can last 2 years. I recently had a call from another community that had some questions about where they were keeping their Eruv, and it turned out that they had not changed their matzah in 15 years, and I advised them that their Eruv very well might be puzzle. I would not want to open that box of matzah and see what's inside. So I encourage them to replace their matzah. All right. Have a very good evening.